My name's Amanda Nickerson. I'm the director of the Alberti Center for Bullying and Abuse Prevention. And I'm pleased to let you know that for the first time at our Colloquium series, we have our benefactor, Dr. Jean Alberti here. She's in back there. Give her a wave. So many of you have benefited from her generosity. So we're glad that she's here. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Lyndsay Jenkins, this morning. Dr. Jenkins has her PhD in school psychology from Northern Illinois University, and she's also a nationally certified school psychologist. She's currently an assistant professor at Florida State University. She was at Eastern Illinois prior to that, and she's the program coordinator of the school psychology program. She's an associate editor for the Journal of School Psychology, and she was the recipient of our 2016 Early Career Award from the Alberti Center for Bullying and Abuse Prevention. So I'm thrilled that she is here to present her work, which is also near and dear to my heart on bystander intervention and different approaches that we know that we can take and the research surrounding that. So please welcome Lyndsay Jenkins.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here today. Actually, the story of how Amanda and I started working together really started with me stalking her at NASP one year. She was doing a paper presentation, and I was a grad student. I think I was a grad student, or maybe first couple years of teaching, and so afterwards I went up to her and I said, I just wanted to introduce myself, and it felt very awkward, but it's turned into a great collaboration. We've published together, done some great applications together, and so we have a lot of similar interests. So I'm so happy to be here, and several of you, I think, were at the conference Tuesday, right? A couple people were there. So it was a great conference, and there is just so many new areas of bullying research that are emerging. And I taught at Eastern Illinois University for 5 years before going to Florida State, and I'll never forget while I was there, one of the search committee members, he was from outside of the department, and he wasn't able to be there when I was on campus doing my campus interview. So he called my office at my institution at the time. I was 15 minutes before class was starting. He called me and he said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so from Florida State. I was on the search committee." I was like, "Okay," because I just wanted to talk to you since I couldn't be there. And he said, "Well, I see you study bullying. Is that really still a thing?" I was like, how do you answer that question in a very nice way? Luckily, I must have answered it fine because he also recommended me for the job, apparently. So it was just such an interesting thing that people think, oh, that's bullying still a thing? And I was shocked by that, but most of us know that, yes, that is still a problem, and students are still facing that issue, and there are lots of areas that are undiscovered. There's a lot of future research within the realm of bullying and peer victimization. So I have been studying bullying for maybe about 10 years or so. My dissertation was on bullying. I did some research projects related to bullying in graduate school, and my interest has sort of changed over time. The easy answer is yes, I study bullying, and that's what I would tell a stranger that asked me what I study. But the better answer, the longer answer is really I'm interested in not just the bully and the victim, but everybody else that's involved, both kids, peers, but also the adults that are around bullying. And the area where I see my research going in the future is looking at what are the different types of actions that people can take to be a more pro-social bystander. And hopefully I make a good case for why we need lots of different options for bystander intervention and not just one single option, okay? If you don't mind, I'll try to get through some of the slides and leave plenty of time at the end for questions. But if you have a burning question that you can't hold on to, just feel free to ask. So some of the goals for today are to make sure everybody understands bullying roles and that there are different bullying roles. It's not just about the bully and the victim. We'll talk about the 5-step bystander intervention model in bullying, and also identify some personal vulnerabilities for bystanders that we should consider. And then finally, some implications for future directions of bystander intervention in bullying. Okay, so number one is to make sure that everybody has a good understanding of the different bystander roles. So of course we have the primary roles of the bully and the victim. So bullying and victimization are some of those primary things that we study. But then there's bystanders. So some research has shown that up to 80% of peer victimization episodes has somebody else around. So there's some sort of person there to witness this peer victimization. And roughly we could call those people call them bystanders, but we also can divide them up into different roles. So this is not new. This research, Christina Salmavali in 1996, some of her colleagues, she was talking about these different bystander roles. And so assisting would be, those are kids that support the bully in some way. They encourage them or they support them. Defending would be the more pro-social bystander, where they intervene in some way on behalf of the victim. And then also outsiders. And those are kids that pretend not to see bullying, or they just purposely ignore it. Okay, so there are some kids that may not be aware of bullying that could maybe be an outsider as well, but for the most part we think of outsiders as being individuals who are ignoring it. Okay, so they're not supporting the bully directly, but they're not doing anything to help the victim. They're just ignoring it. One other role that people sometimes talk about, but I tend not to use as much, is the reinforcing role, which it's very similar to the assistant role, where they are encouraging or reinforcing what the bullying is doing. But there's a lot of overlap, and it kind of depends on the context of when someone might fall in as a reinforcer or as an assister or even as a bully. So we have these primary bullying roles. And when we think about bullying not just being about a perpetrator and a victim, when we think about it broader, we also have to consider how these things are taking place within a broader context. So the common theoretical model that we use to study bullying behavior is often within this social ecological model of bullying. And this should look very familiar if you've learned about Bronfenbrenner's, ecological model, where you have all these concentric circles. It's the same idea, just applied specifically to bullying. So with this model, individuals have their own characteristics. We all have our own personality characteristics, physical characteristics, genetic factors that might make us have a bigger tendency to engage in one of these roles or in others. So someone might have some personal characteristics that make them more likely to be a defender, or make them more likely to be victimized or to be a perpetrator. So every individual has these personal characteristics. And actually a lot of my research thus far has really looked at examining characteristics of people that engage in different bullying roles. However, these individuals are not just, I feel like we should not just look at things that are inside a person or these personal characteristics. We need to look outside of that. So when we are looking at individuals, they all have a variety of social relationships. And those could be relationships with parents, with teachers, with principals, with other peers. So their personal characteristics are also related to the types of social relationships that they have. And of course, those social relationships are taking place in the context of a community. And that could be a neighborhood community, the community of a whole town, or even more specifically, it could be the school community. So thinking about the school climate, social norms within the school, so thinking about characteristics of that school community. And of course, the communities are housed within our broader society and our cultural values and cultural norms. And so I like this model to think about bullying because it sort of forces us to take this big picture view, kind of a bird's eye view type of things. So we're not only looking at what are things within one child, or what are characteristics about one child that makes bullying more likely to occur to them, but what are some big picture things that is creating a bullying environment in our schools. And so the idea of these different bullying roles in the social ecological model of bullying are two of the things that drive not only my research, but a lot of bullying researchers. Those two things drive a lot of our research that we're doing. So if you're taking a look at people outside of the bully and the victim role, clearly the bystanders, everybody else, their role becomes very important, okay? So as I said earlier, about 80% of peer victimization occurs in the presence of bystanders, and those could be adults or they could be kids or adolescents, but that's a very large percentage of peer victimization that is occurring with somebody else around. So the logical thing is, oh, well, those people need to do something. Those bystanders need to do something, not just witness it, but they should do something. If you think about reinforcing, assisting, and ignoring, those bystander roles tend to create this pro-bullying norm within a school. So in more of an antisocial way, those bystanders are playing a role in bullying. And then, of course, defending, there's been a lot of research talking about the positive effects of defending, both for stopping an ongoing bullying episode, but also the impact on the victims that have somebody standing up for them. So there was an observational study done in 2001 that showed when they were on playgrounds watching kids interact, and if somebody went up to an ongoing bullying situation and tried to intervene, that situation tended to stop within 10 seconds about 60% of the time. And so that's one piece of evidence that when somebody intervenes, bullying does tend to stop. They also have asked questions to victims of how does it make you feel when somebody intervenes on your behalf. And they tend to have, if somebody has somebody intervene for them, they tend to feel safer at school, they tend to have less anxiety and depression symptoms, and also higher self-esteem. So we have a lot of evidence that bystanders can be important, and they do play a very important role in bullying prevention and intervention. But bystander research is not new by any means. It's newer to applying it to bullying, but it's certainly not new in the grand scheme of things. John Darley and Bibb Latané were social psychologists. However, how many of you have heard of the bystander effect? Like a social psych, kind of an intro to social psych class. So that is essentially, their research was looking at studying individuals' behavior in reaction to when an emergency situation was going on. And they have some really interesting research. And I used to work with one of John Darley's graduate students. He was a faculty member at Eastern Illinois when I was there. And we had some really interesting discussions about the research that they did at the time when he was a grad student. A lot of this was coming out, and it was really interesting to talk to him and about all the different studies. I'm not sure some of those would get by IRB anymore. I don't think that there's some questionable ethical things that might have been going on in terms of setting up very realistic emergency situations and seeing how people would react. I definitely don't think we could get by that with kids. We're not going to set up emergency situations with kids. I think that would be very tricky. However, it would be very interesting. But the bystander effect was one of the main things that came out of that line of research. And the bystander effect basically is the more people are around, the less people are likely to intervene, kind of assuming someone else will intervene, or there might be some social learning theory going on where you model your behavior after those around you. So if no one else is intervening, then I'm not going to intervene. There's a reason for that. I'm not going to intervene as well. So the more people that are around, the less likely someone is to intervene. They might be modeling behavior. They might be assuming someone else will intervene. But then also it can be very costly, both in terms of time. It could be distressing to intervene in emergency situations. So could be a high cost that is there for intervening. And then another thing that came out of their research related to bystander interventions in emergency situations was their 5-step bystander intervention model. And Amanda and some of her colleagues have taken that and applied that to how might that we look at bullying situations and people's decisions to intervene using this 5-step model. So the notice is the first step. So of course you have to notice an event in order to engage in the rest of these steps. If you were noticing, well, how would notice apply to bullying? Any thoughts? How could notice apply to bullying? To notice the event. What if people don't think of something as bullying? So it may not be that they aren't noticing it, but they may not be labeling a specific behavior as bullying. Okay, so if you have kids in your school that think bullying's not a problem here, it may not be a problem, or they may not really know the definition of bullying. They may not know what behaviors count as bullying. Okay, so step 1 is notice the event. Step 2 is then interpret it as an emergency needing intervention. So if we apply that to bullying, there may be kids that don't think of bullying as an emergency or as a social emergency. Okay, they may think of it as, oh, that happens all the time here, and that's not a big deal. Okay, so if they're not interpreting it as something that needs intervention, then of course they're not going to engage in the rest of these steps. Accepting responsibility, so that is sort of the opposite of the diffusion of responsibility, where I feel personally responsible to intervene on behalf of this person. Know how to help, so that is, do they have the skills, the knowledge, the ability to intervene? And then the last step would be act. So that's the actual decision to intervene in a situation. We often think about kids walking through this 5-step model, but also this definitely applies to adults. And so you could also ask the teachers in your schools if they engage in this 5-step model. And I actually had a graduate student do that for her master's thesis, and she asked teachers about each of these steps, and she actually applied it to both bullying that's happening at school as well as cyberbullying. And she found some really interesting findings about how there were really big differences in whether teachers thought it was their responsibility to intervene. And there were big differences if it was bullying at school versus cyberbullying. And people had very different responses when they were asked do you feel responsible for intervening with cyberbullying versus if you feel responsible for intervening in more traditional at-school bullying. So though we think of this applying to kids, this can certainly apply to adults as well. So it's not a big surprise that there's decades of literature, thousands of articles talking about how bullying is a problem in schools. We hear media stories about it. Our schools are always discussing it. Parents are talking about it. And there have been a lot of attempts to come up with ways to reduce bullying. Some of them a little bit better than others. And so some anti-bullying programs tend to rely on more low impact practices, in not that they are bad things necessarily, but they are not likely to make a really big impact. So what I mean by that are things like coming up with a discipline policy for how to address somebody who is bullying another student. So almost kind of how are we going to punish perpetrators? It could be groups or individual or group counseling for victims or assertiveness training. There's nothing wrong with either of those things, but if that is what a school is calling a bullying prevention program, it's probably not going to make that big of an impact. only posting anti-bullying posters around in a school is probably not going to make that big of a difference unless those are supported by an ongoing program that's at the school, or you're trying to change some of the social norms and that type of thing. I think anonymous comment boxes or ways to anonymously report bullying either from the school website or an app, or I think those are great things, but by themselves, these are probably not going to make that big of an impact on a whole school level bullying issue. There are programs that can be purchased and implemented at schools, and they are specifically focused at bullying prevention and intervention. Unfortunately, some of the research is showing not so great impacts with those kind of targeted bullying prevention programs. They tend to have fairly small to moderate effects, and some fairly recent research has shown that there could even be harmful effects at the high school level, which is very concerning because it's doing the opposite of what you wanted it to do. And we could probably discuss for an hour about why that might be happening. But these kind of targeted bullying prevention programs maybe aren't doing exactly what they want them to do. The implementation of whole school social emotional learning programs, that is showing more positive effects than just the targeted bullying prevention program. So rather than waiting for bullying to get to a point where we need to punish bullies or we need to counsel victims or we need these kind of high-level bullying things happening, if you kind of start at the ground level and teach kids appropriate social and emotional skills and behaviors from the ground level and teach them, the idea is that people wouldn't engage in bullying if they had appropriate social and emotional skills. And so there's a lot of state level initiatives for implementing social emotional learning standards. It varies. I think all 50 states have preschool level social emotional standards, but only a handful of states have social emotional learning standards K through 12, just like there's academic standards. So there's this parallel of having at kindergarten, what are some social emotional learning standards that all kindergartners should be able to meet, and what are some fifth grade standards. So it's becoming more popular for schools or for states to have a state Department of Education to have these standards. But these broader scale social emotional learning programs, we're starting to see some pretty good effects on bullying from implementing these type of programs. Another more promising intervention for bullying is to involve bystanders. And so rather than just discouraging people from bullying or telling them how to handle things when somebody bullies them, if you are training up bystanders, we're seeing there's some more promising effects when programs include bystanders as part of the bullying prevention program. And that's also not really new. So there's been a lot of research looking at how bystanders can be used to prevent other types of interpersonal violence, such as hazing, sexual assault, binge drinking, sexual harassment. So there have been a lot of research, particularly with high school, but a lot of college-age students, of how we can use bystanders to prevent other types of interpersonal violence. So it's certainly, there's evidence for using bystanders as a way to prevent these various forms of interpersonal violence. So because bullying is such an issue, because there's evidence that bystanders can make a difference, we often start to see these types of messages being used. And I've seen TV commercials. These are posters. I just looked online for examples, but we see things like very action-oriented. Speak up. If you see something, don't say something. You should do something. Be an upstander, bystander power. So these are, just examples of encouraging people to step in, actively try to step into a ongoing bullying situation. And I think these are great, but not for all students. I don't think all students are equally equipped in order to do this successfully, because I think there's some kids who have varying levels of personal vulnerabilities that this may not be a great suggestion for them. And by encouraging everybody to step in and say something and do something, I'm worried that there could be some unintended long-term effects. And so I'm actually going to do a biology lesson to demonstrate this. Just hang with me. I promise it makes sense in the end. Okay, so as Amanda said, I live in Florida. I'm originally from Illinois, so I'm fairly new to Florida. I just moved there about a year and a half ago. And I live in Tallahassee, that little blue dot there. And when my family and I moved, we were going to the beach every weekend, because you live in Florida, you wanted to go to the beach. And we had lived in the Midwest our whole lives, so this was a treat to be 45 minutes from the beach. So we would go to the beach all the time, and a few weeks in, my husband started talking about wanting to buy a boat. Pretty common thing for, if you live on the coast, have a boat. That's not that uncommon. Okay, so I had said, well, I think we should wait, let's settle in. Maybe next summer we could buy a boat. So then 6 weeks later, we had a boat. And not 52 weeks like I was asking, but 6 weeks later, we had a boat. And we're getting a little more adventurous. So at first, there was one place that had a ramp that was easy to do, and we knew what we were doing. But we're getting a little more adventurous, and we're trying some different spots along the coast of where to put our boat in. So most recently, we found this little place. So if you kind of zoom in, this is, has anyone heard of St. George Island? It's this little, very small town, and it's an island, clearly. It's this small little beachy area, but it's not kind of the tourist area like Panama City Beach. It's very touristy. So this is more like, they try to sell it as this is old school Florida, like old Florida. And so it is very pretty. So that's our newest adventure, is to go to St. George Island. But here, this is Dog Island. There's no bridge to it. You can only get to it by boat. There's a few houses, but there's beach all along here. So our new thing is that we will put our boat in up at Lanark and then go fishing. So like down here, we're fishing. And then we come back because the kids are complaining about fishing so much. So then we come back and then we spend the afternoon at the beach. And I have 3 kids, and they complain a lot whenever they don't get in their beach time. So we have to hold them off to the afternoon, and then we go to the beach. Okay, so I promise this is related to bystander intervention. Just hang on. Okay, so when you're driving to get out to where we go fishing or to Dog Island, this is what it looks like. Okay, so the water, you can see if there's really big changes in the water color, but for the most part, it's just blue, and you see if there's land sticking up out of the water. Okay, so in the very far distance, you can see there's some land back there. But for the most part, this is what you see. You're just kind of driving along and, hoping you don't hit anything. Okay, so in order for us to get out to Dog Island or to go fishing, clearly we're not going to do that, right? So there's this little, it's kind of like a sandbar, but it's this little mini island here that you can't get around. So our goal is to get down here, and we have to go through there, okay? Clearly that would be a bad idea. So the next logical option might be to do this, okay? So you go around, and then you cut through this little opening here, okay? That also is not a good option, and I'll explain why in a second. So this is what we do. We put our boat in there, and then we go parallel to the coast for a while, and then we make a fairly sharp turn and then go out this little opening. And the reason that this is a good idea this one's a good idea, this one's a bad idea, is because the water is fairly shallow. And at different times of the day, when the tide is changing, it can be really shallow in that your boat might actually get stuck. But also, even if you do get through, you can cause some damage. And the reason we knew to go along the coastline and then come out is because we did a ton of research. So anytime, especially my husband, he will do all this research about how do I, navigate the boat to make sure I don't hit anything, where are the good fishing spots. If you look at it from this bird's eye view, from this big picture view, you can sort of see that there's some, can you see that from there? So there's like a different color. And the reason that's a different color is because that's more shallow right there. And so the water is not as deep. It's fine here, but then right here it's shallow. Okay, so if we would cut through there, if we took option 2, something like this might happen. Okay, and those lines in the sand are caused from the propeller chewing up the seagrass as it goes through. So your boat could easily make it through and not touch the bottom, but the propeller can still tear up the seagrass. Okay, so you can see they actually call these cow trails or sea scars. There's a lot of terms for it. We usually call them cow trails because that's what a friend of ours called them. And so there are these marks where it's torn up the seagrass. And that's problematic for a lot of reasons. Number 1, it's hard on your propeller, okay? After a while, that could be harmful. Number 2, it can take up to 10 years for seagrass to regenerate after it's been torn up. So 10 years before those lines are gonna go away. And seagrass is really important to the ecology of an ocean because it is the primary food source for a lot of species, but also this is the home to a lot of species. So manatees are a protected species and they eat hundreds of pounds of seagrass a day. Hundreds of pounds. So if we're tearing up their seagrass, that's their primary diet. That can be very problematic. And they're already a protected species. But also there's tons of fish that live inside the seagrass. The little fish hide in there hoping the big fish don't find them. But then the big fish do typically find them. So then you have big fish coming into the seagrass so that they can eat. And then the bigger fish eat those big fish and so on. Okay, the whole food chain is impacted when there's these sea scars or when people are going through and tearing up the seagrass. Okay, and I think that people are not doing this maliciously, but if they're not seeing that big picture, if they don't think about the long-term impacts of their decision just to kind of cut short and do the most efficient route to be able to get past this, there could be these long-term negative impacts on people we don't even see or species we don't even see. And I'm afraid that's what might be happening or what could happen if we are expecting all youth to intervene directly. So if we expect all youth to just go and say, stop, you shouldn't do that, or directly intervene, either physically or verbally, whatever it might be, I'm afraid we could be inadvertently creating a situation where there are kids that might be at risk, kids that don't have a skill set to do that, and we might be putting them at risk for further victimization or more negative long-term impacts. Even though we didn't intentionally mean to do that, I'm afraid if we just encourage everybody to do that, that could be problematic. So that's why I would like to argue for this multidimensional understanding of bystander behavior. Okay, so you could grossly divide bystander behavior into sort of antisocial and pro-social. So antisocial being things like ignoring, aggressively intervening. Okay, so if you see bullying and then you go punch the perpetrator, well, you're sort of, aggressively intervening. Even though the motive is good because you're trying to help somebody, it's still more of an aggressive intervention or retaliation. I've seen this happen in schools where to get back at the bully, the perpetrator, a group might say, well, let's exclude them from everything, or let's be mean to them. A very extreme example is somebody was being very much victimized. It was through relational aggression, and as a retaliation, this girl's friends created a website of like, we hate so-and-so. So the idea was that they were trying to get back at the person who is being aggressive, but ultimately they were also then bullying the original perpetrator. So these more antisocial approaches to intervention probably are not things that we need to be recommending to kids. But when you think about pro-social interventions, I think we do have lots of options. So the direct intervention is like what I was saying earlier. When you step in, it's action-oriented. You do something kind of in the moment. You're there to intervene on behalf of somebody. And I'm not saying at all that that is bad, because I think that is very appropriate. And some kids do have the ability, they have the skill set to be able to do that. So we should certainly not assume that just because I'm saying we shouldn't do that for everybody, that certainly does not mean that we should not include that as a potential intervention. But other things that we could do are involve school adults, involve parents, doing more emotional intervention type work where it's after bullying has occurred, there are ways to maybe include the victim or try to help them cope or help them problem solve is a very specific type of how you can work with an individual, with a friend to help them, problem solve, kind of process through it, be friendly to them, invite them to be part of your friend group, and those types of things. So I think there are plenty of pro-social intervention options that we need to think carefully about, not encouraging everybody to just kind of barrel into a situation, but to be a little more nuanced in our recommendations. Recently, I have made attempts to create a way to measure this, and it's quite complicated. So essentially, I created a measure and gave it to kids, and these are the subscales that fell out from the factor analysis. But there's also differences I'm finding of if the victim was known or unknown. So if this is happening to my friend versus if those things were happening to somebody I don't know, you might have different behaviors. And I think we could all think of a time where it's like, well, yeah, if that was my best friend being victimized, I would do that, but not for just anybody, okay? Also, if, so known or unknown victim, but also there seems to be some differences in the types of interventions students might do if it's a physical bullying situation versus if it's verbal bullying going on or more relational bullying. So people might intervene differently depending on the type of situation, and then also if the victim is known or unknown. So my question is, should we expect all students to do all of these pro-social interventions? And I, spoiler alert, say no. I think that we should probably think more carefully about that, and not just expect everybody to do that direct intervention, okay? Sort of the next step in my research is to look about how can we maybe figure out which kids could intervene in certain ways. And so almost like looking at characteristics of kids that engage in these different types of pro-social interventions. I think this area of the research is so new, but it's also pretty messy. It's a little hard to think about how, okay, if I look at you, I'm going to say that, oh yeah, you are a direct intervention kid. Oh no, you're going to be an emotional intervention. Like, I don't think it's as clear cut as what it might seem to be. But I guess the basic message is that I think we should value all of these different types of pro-social interventions and be careful about making everyone feel like that they aren't doing a good job unless they do that direct intervention. So some reasons why I think we should use caution. Number one is this idea of role fluidity, okay? So the basic idea is that typically we don't find kids that are bullies only, victims only, defender only, outsider only. Often we're finding kids engage in some at least moderate level of most of these behaviors. So bullying tends to be very situation dependent, or it's in this situation I might be a victim, but in this situation I could actually be the perpetrator. So we can't really label kids as, pure victims. They're likely involved in other types of bullying roles. Right now I'm writing up a paper where I asked kids to tell me how often do you engage in bullying, victimization, assisting, outsider, and defending behavior. So those 5 major roles. I had kids tell me how often they engaged in those. And I went to, you're gonna laugh at me, stats camp over the summer. Everyone thinks I'm so nerdy when I say that. It is very nerdy. So I went to stats camp over the summer to learn how to do latent profile analysis, which sounds very fancy, and it is a little bit over my head still, even after a week of stats camp. But essentially, that allows us to look at what are different profiles kids have, okay? So I had them every kid ended up with a score on all 5 of those roles. So what are the different profiles? Well, one potential profile would be high score on bullying, low score everything else. Okay, that would make it super clean, but that did not happen. And in fact, a victim-only group did not show, a bully-only profile, that was not there, defender-only, none of those single role profiles emerged from this analysis. What did emerge was that 46% of the kids had moderate levels of involvement in all 5 of those roles, okay? Another 46% of the kids fell into a profile that I called victimized defender, okay? So those are kids that had high scores on defending as well as high scores on victimization, but low scores on all the other areas. And 6% of the group I labeled aggressive victimized defender, which were the same kids that they were victimized and they defended others, but they also reported that they were aggressive at times too, so they engaged in bullying. And then 2% had just high levels of involvement in all areas. And this is not unique, because a colleague of mine who was also at Stats Camp also was doing similar analyses, and she also found a very similar pattern where these single profile groups were not showing up, okay? So the reason I mention all that is because if we have kids, it's like this group, 46% of the kids said that they engaged in high levels of defending, but those kids were also victimized, okay? So in some ways, being victimized might maybe make them more empathetic to other people who are being victimized, so therefore they feel like they need to intervene. But if we're encouraging kids who were already victims to then put yourself out there and actively defend another person, there could be some problems with that. They could be re-victimized. They're putting themselves in a socially risky situation. So I think that there could be some problems with that, okay? Also, different skills and characteristics. And so it's just overwhelming, the evidence that shows kids who are victimized tend to have some degree of mental health problems, and that's not a surprise at all. And generally, the more chronically they're victimized, the higher the risk of those mental health problems. So even clinically significant levels of mental health difficulties, anxiety and depression, self-esteem, stress, those types of things. So we have kids that are playing multiple roles. Kids that are victimized often have these mental health difficulties. But also, it's becoming more clear that being bullied as a child is a type of an ACE, or an adverse childhood experience. And there, if you read any of the trauma literature, or you're looking at trauma-informed practices in school, that's becoming a lot more common in education. And if you look at that, if you think of bullying as one of those ACEs, so as an adverse childhood experience, it makes you think, okay, well, I've been studying bullying all along, but really this is a form of trauma. Okay, if we think of it that way, the way we approach bullying prevention may be changing. Okay, so if we think of bullying as a type of trauma, I think that really does fit, because SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Agency, they define this childhood trauma occurs after an event that is physically or emotionally harmful to a degree that it may have an enduring effect on well-being. And in some ways, that seems like a definition of bullying, especially more chronic bullying that's happening over a long period of time. So I think if we're going to think of bullying as a type of traumatic event that a child could experience, it might change the way we go about intervening. SAMHSA has some suggestions for in trauma-informed practices. And so I've taken these and then just expanded them to include peer victimization and bullying. Okay, so their 4 R's is what they, how they kind of couch their trauma-informed practices. And so the first R is realize that trauma and peer victimization are widespread. Okay, so all the peer victimization stuff, those are things I added. Number 2, recognize signs of trauma and peer victimization and their overlap. Okay, so I think we need to recognize a lot of the same symptoms or signs that somebody has gone through trauma, and a lot of the signs and symptoms of kids who are being victimized at school, there's a lot of overlap there. So I think we need to realize that. Number 4, respond using evidence-based practices, trauma-informed practices to increase bystander intervention. And then number 4, resist re-traumatization by teaching multiple types of bystander interventions, not only direct interventions. Okay, so resisting re-traumatization is kind of one of the main things that made me think we should not be encouraging all kids to directly intervene. We might need to think a little more broadly about what we're recommending to these students. And so realize, recognize, respond, and resist are the 4 R's of looking at things through this trauma-informed lens. So some risks of encouraging intervention by all, and I mean direct intervention by all, is that risk of re-victimization. But also I think it could make somebody feel guilty if they're not directly intervening. At the conference on Tuesday, I went to one of the afternoon breakouts, and they handed out a booklet, and the topic was speaking up, but it was in the terms of an educator speaking up if they heard discrimination and bias in their classroom. So it was a little bit different because it was a teacher being told to speak up if they saw bias in their classroom. And one of the things, the very first page, it said, everyone should speak up every time, right when it happens, never miss a beat. You always should do it. And I was thinking, oh, well, that's not what I would say. But then the presenter actually did say, she goes, I don't know how I feel about that. Because if you don't, for whatever reason, if you don't intervene, you could feel guilty about that. If you, and we have all, I'm sure everyone in this room has had an experience of you should have stopped to say something and you didn't. We can probably all think of a time. I mean, even just like driving down the road and someone's changing their tire, I'm like, I should stop. No, I'm not going to. I just keep going. So we all have had times where you sort of feel like maybe you should have said something, you should have done something, but you didn't. And so if these kids are already at risk for some mental health difficulties, they've been victimized before, and now we're telling them you need to intervene, and they're not, for whatever reason, they maybe could feel guilty about that. then I think it also, we're not really validating all the different types of pro-social efforts, okay? So we're not necessarily saying to people, yes, that's great that you are trying to be friendly to them, or you're trying to help them problem solve, or you're involving an adult in the situation. You're not really giving them credit for all of those different actions that are still pro-social and could have a positive impact on the victim. Okay, so we're not really recognizing that. Okay, so where do we go from here? I think one is don't create cow trails on our mission towards bullying prevention. Okay, so if we are boating and we are cutting in these cow trails, you know, we may not mean to be doing that, but it can have those long-term impacts. And I think we need to keep that in mind when it comes to creating better bullying prevention and intervention programs. So just because something on the surface maybe seems like a great idea, we need to step back and think bigger about what are these potential long-term implications for our prevention efforts, our intervention efforts. I also would like to see more development of this trauma-informed bullying prevention framework. I would like to do this. I actually submitted a grant over the summer to create an intervention program using this trauma-informed lens. And it's really surprising to me that there was only a handful of, doing literature searches on Google Scholar, on library websites. There's very, very few. I can only think of 2 articles that use the term trauma-informed bullying prevention or trauma-informed bystander intervention. So it's really not being used yet, but I think it just seems very logical with the trauma-informed practices movement and bullying prevention, social emotional learning. I think these all just make sense and they should really go together. Also, another big point, conceptualize and encourage bystander intervention as multiple actions. So not just about direct intervention, but all of those different options. And of course, most of my talk has focused on peers as bystanders, but I think we cannot ignore the role of adults as bystanders. And if we expect people to directly intervene, it should definitely be the adults. I think we can't expect kids to intervene if they're not seeing adults at school intervene. And that is a big part of why I think we're not seeing the levels of bystander intervention that maybe we would want to see, because I'm not sure all adults feel that they're responsible for intervening or they don't know how to intervene. And it's so wishy-washy with cyberbullying, and some schools have policies on that, but if it's happening off school grounds, as a teacher, how am I supposed to intervene? What are my limits? Because this isn't happening at school. And so that discussion, I think, makes adults maybe more tentative to intervene, but I do think that we need to be modeling these appropriate behaviors for the kids, not just expecting kids to do this on their own. Okay, so some final thoughts. Bullying is bad, sad face. Bystanders can help, happy face. And then be careful in who we encourage to intervene and how we encourage them to intervene. Just as a plug, to be continued, next fall, most likely, there's going to be a special issue for the Journal of School Psychology focused on bystander interventions. And Dr. Wendy Troop-Gordon at Auburn University, she and I are co-editing this special issue, and we're very excited about the papers that are going to be in this special issue. It's really exciting. I think we're really sort of trying to push the envelope with making people think outside the box a little bit. And I'm hoping that next fall around this time, hopefully that will be out, and so there'll be a lot new, fresh research that we can cite in terms of bystanders and bullying. And that is all I have. Yes.
This is such a great talk.
Thank you.
Really interesting. I was really struck by this idea that we shouldn't be asking all youth to directly intervene or engage in direct, I don't know the right words, So things are more direct and active. And I was just wondering, is there evidence that like shy youth or those with other individual characteristics sort of struggle with being a direct bystander?
Yeah,
Or are these your ideas? I mean, I think they're really great.
Yeah, that is a really great question. I think related to that, and shyness in bullying, in the bullying literature, seems like it's not explored as much. But I've always thought that, so kids we are labeling as outsiders might be some children who do feel badly, they know how to intervene, but because of maybe shyness or something else that they aren't intervening, or there's something inhibiting that. And in some ways, I think we need to do a better job of asking, rather than kind of slapping a label and saying this is ignoring, this is bad. It may not truly be ignoring. And there's some literature to suggest that this may be happening, because sometimes if you compare kids that do more of the active defending and then more of the ignoring, they tend to have similar levels of empathy, and they also tend to know what to do to a similar degree, but the actual action is what is different. So I think like what you're saying might capture some of those differences. It's not sort of antisocial ignoring because there's something, inhibiting them from doing that pro-social intervention, even though they want to do it. But I think for those kids, you might recommend more of the like emotional interventions or involving an adult. Those would make a lot of sense. So I think that's why we sort of need to, give equal credit maybe to a lot of these different types of intervention, because there could be some very good reasons why kids aren't choosing to actively intervene. Thank you. Yeah.
So it's a really interesting talk. You've generated lots of ideas. For me, I don't typically think too much about bystander intervention with the work that I do with preschoolers, although I'm going to start thinking a little bit more about it. And I was struck by one of your comments, which was about the pro-social intervention approaches, and how they may be, or just in general, maybe bystander approaches may be different depending on the form of bullying. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about either what you found or what you would predict that you would find there.
So the last few years, I've been working on this never-ending research project with preschool kids. We had teachers rate their pro-social behavior, victimization, and aggression. Not bullying, but aggression. And then we also audio recorded them during free play. And then hundreds of hours later, we have transcribed their audio recordings, and it was pretty painful. Literally painful, because the kids screaming with your earbuds in your ears, and very hysterical at times, but also quite annoying to hear these kids screaming and on the playground. And so we're just finished up coding some of those data. And so I don't have the final numbers, but we created codes for different types of pro-social behavior, and some of it matched up to involve an adult, emotional intervention, and sort of a direct intervention. Hardly any kids were directly intervening, unless maybe verbally, but not active, kind of like physical. We didn't hear that. Tell the teacher was pretty common, but then also more of the emotional, like trying to include kids after somebody had been mean to them, that was pretty common. We also saw some of the retaliation of, well, let's not play with them, or they can't come in here, trying to exclude someone who had just bullied. So we didn't really break it down by type of bullying action, like relational versus physical. But we did look at the types of pro-social things that the kids were doing, and it did seem like there were differences in the different types of approaches kids were taking. You could have called it tattling. Some of them were, tattling, involve an adult, and something maybe reporting, yes, that would be a good.
So, but what about in other developmental periods? Have you looked at, does the form of bullying matter with regard to how bystanders respond?
It does. So I'm working with a colleague in my department to analyze some of this data that I collected. So I created a measure to measure these different types of bystander actions, and I created different scenarios where it was physical bullying, relational, and then verbal, and I had kids do that. So we're still in the sort of factor analysis, make sure this was a good measure stage, but the school was interested in these data. And so roughly I divided out, before I had the factor analytic results, I divided that out. And there do seem to be differences, and there's not a lot of the direct intervention. This was middle school. That seemed to be pretty low. The emotional type interventions and then involving an adult were the two that were most common. But direct intervention, I would say the only caveat was that if it was a friend, they were more likely, if the victim was a friend, they were more likely to intervene. But I would be really interested to see that at elementary and middle school and high school, and see how that might change over time. Yeah. Yes.
Coming from a clinical background, you're saying that bullying actually equals trauma. Then the question is, do they then suffer PTSD? And what would, if they're suffering anything that's going to trigger a memory of that trauma for the bystander, is almost going to immobilize them.
Right.
So has there been any research in that field?
Surprisingly not. So I was at a national conference. I was standing by my lovely poster at a conference one time, and this gentleman came up to me and he said, have you ever thought of peer victimization as a form of PTSD? And I was like, nope, I haven't. And that comment has stuck with me for years. I think that was maybe 12 or 11 or 12 years ago. And his comment has really stuck with me. And so on this grant that I applied for over the summer, that is essentially what my argument was, that the most chronically victimized kids are likely suffering from PTSD, and it is hard to distinguish, is this from victimization or is this, symptoms related to PTSD? But essentially that is why I think we need to be more careful about how we encourage kids to be bystanders, because if they're going to be re-traumatized every time they have a encounter with bullying, they're likely not going to be able to intervene in.
That may explain these mental health problems that you're finding, and it also may explain whether teachers will involve themselves, because they could have been victims.
That's
way
true.
Back when, and they're not, and it re-traumatizes them.
That's true.
It reminds them or creates the anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to prevent their intervention.
That would be interesting to ask teachers about their own past experiences with victimization, and then if that maybe inhibits their own, trying to step up for kids. That could very easily be part of that equation.
What would they have liked, or what did did anybody do anything for them, or that could be another whole dissertation.
Oh yeah. That would be great. Any other questions, comments? Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.